Hi there, folks. My name is Eddie Ludlow. I'm the founder of the Whisky Lounge, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Scotch Malt Whisky Tasting Pack that you should have in front of you. If you don't have it in front of you, pause now and go and get it because we're about to get going. And we've got some really delicious whiskies for you in this pack. I'm sure you've been looking forward to tasting it already. Just before we get going, a couple of recommendations for you. Have some adequate glassware available. If it's just wine glasses, that's okay. We tend to use, and you'll see me using these Glen Turret nosing glasses, which are specifically designed for nosing and tasting whiskey. The reason I like them is a combination of things. Firstly, they're quite robust, so they don't break too easily. And we go through quite a lot of them, as you can imagine, when we were doing physical events, and when we hopefully will get to doing physical events again, because of this heavy base. Also, they have this lovely kind of tulip shape, which funnels the aromas into your nose. So it really helps you to get to grips with and analyze the whiskies that you're going to be tasting. So if you've got any of those lying about, please do assemble them. If you don't, smaller wine glasses will do. Preferably not tumblers or straight up and down glasses, because they tend to allow the aromas to escape either side of your nose, which is not what we're looking for here. Okay, so just before we get started on the whiskies themselves, just to quickly run you through the whiskey making process again, just in case you're not familiar with it or you'd like just a quick refresh. So at most distilleries, whether they be in Scotland for the purposes of today, but distilleries all around the world, this is the first thing that will be delivered to the distillery in order to start making whiskey, assuming that they already have lots of water and some yeast standing by as well. So this is malted barley. You won't be able to see the malted form here. Well, maybe you can actually. So this has been processed in an industrial maltings, which is really where most distilleries will get their malted barley from. Most distilleries now require a huge amount of the stuff, and to actually malt it themselves would be too much to ask. Some still do it, a little bit of it, or in some cases all of it, but they tend to be of the smaller production varietal, and therefore able to cope with the volume that they need. Now, at the distillery, each distillery will have its own mill, and this is what they do with the mill. They grind down the malted barley into a grist, which essentially looks like Alpen. Essentially what you're trying to do there, or what you are doing, is splitting the seed open to allow access to the sugary starches in there. At that point, we need to flush the grist with lots and lots of hot water of ever increasing temperatures. This essentially explodes the sugar out of the seed, which will later convert into alcohol. This sugary, watery solution that's left behind is called wort. And it's the wort that we then add yeast to in order to create the first alcohol portion. Now, when the yeast is added to the sugary solution, to the wort, it starts working away at it straight away. It's a very aggressive process, and it starts to convert the sugar in the solution into alcohol, but also into CO2 and a bit of heat as well. And you end up, depending on how long the fermentation time is, with a alcohol level of between 7 and 9% ABV. It also does depend on the climate you're in, whether the fermentation tanks or washbacks are temperature controlled and so on. But generally speaking, particularly in Scotland, fermentation times tend to be between 48 hours in some distilleries, up to well over 100 hours in other distilleries. I mean, there is quite a lot of argument from certain quarters of the whiskey geekosphere, as we call it, that longer fermentation times tend to lead to a more estery, fruity beer or wash, which will have a knock-on effect to the final spirit. And certainly, the longer fermentation time whiskies that we've tasted would possibly see this borne out. But that's not to say there aren't tasty whiskies to be had from those distilleries that have a shorter fermentation time. So it doesn't always follow. Anyway, so the other thing that we're going to use apart from the glass today for tasting is water. Now, water is vitally important both for production but also for tasting. And almost for the same reason, you're looking for something that's very, very pure, spring water. It doesn't have to be spring water from the distillery, but it should be a very pure spring water that isn't going to add flavors, but it's going to enhance flavors and aromas. We're currently using water from these guys, Larkfire, which is a water from the far reaches of northern Scotland, and is perfect for adding to whiskey. You could use something like Highland Spring or other spring waters. You want to generally avoid mineral waters because they do contain minerals, which can add flavors that you don't necessarily want in your whiskey. So just be aware of that. And tap water, okay, use tap water if you absolutely have to. Filter it if you can, at least. But if you're in the city and you're using a tap water, there's necessary additives in that water to make it safe to drink. But they can bring out some, or they can add components to the aromas and the flavors of the whiskey that wouldn't otherwise be there. So you're kind of manipulating the flavor, which you don't necessarily want to do. Anyway, let's get started. I'm looking forward to this. So the first whiskey we're going to be tasting is from Kingsbarns Distillery, which is a relatively new distillery. Now I'm just going to bring up a slide, a little presentation so you can see. Excuse me, I haven't started that. There we go. So you should be able to see it. So these are the 6 distilleries and their locations, as you can see on the map there. They're quite widely spread out, actually, which is always a good thing. Just to show off the variety of the distilleries of Scotland. And the first one, as I say, is Kingsbarns, which is here. So it's in the Kingdom of Fife, not far from St Andrews, and as I say, is quite a new distillery. It was conceptualized by an ex-golf caddy who just thought that the area really lent itself well to distilling, and certainly the lowlands, which is where Kingsbarns is based, used to be a real hotbed of whiskey distilling, and certainly in the recent years it has become so once again. And there you can see what Kingsbarns looks like from the exterior. Particularly nice day. I'm not quite sure how many days they see like that, but that day was pretty good. And on the right hand side you can see the inside with one of the stills, with the distillery manager there, Peter, who's a lovely guy, and he's there looking after the whiskey making process. Okay, so as you can see from there, they have a pair of Forsyth stills, copper pot stills, which are kind of the industry standard. These are the stills that everyone in the whiskey making world aspires to. These Forsyth stills, Forsyths, Richard Forsyth, they are the premier copper pot still manufacturer and distilling equipment manufacturer in the world. So you see Forsyth stills literally all over the world, in Taiwan, India, Sweden, and so on. So it is they are extremely highly sought after. In terms of maturation, they use mainly ex-bourbon with some STR, that's shaved, toasted, and recharred casks, generally wine casks, as well as ex-sherry and other wine casks. They tend to use an unpeated barley, or maybe really lightly peated, but I believe it's unpeated, and you get that in the as we taste it. And the bottling that we're going to taste is called Dream to Dram, and is the first single malt release from Kingsbarns. As you can see, they were only started producing in 2015, so you do a very quick calculation. The whiskey coming from there is not 5 years maximum. Okay, so I'm going to pour myself a little of the Kingsbarns. So this is from first fill bourbon and STR casks. Now the STR cask is a concept that was designed by a gentleman called Dr. Jim Swan, who essentially was a whiskey magician. He worked at the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, and latterly he was a traveling whiskey guru. So distilleries or people wanting to build a distillery would go to Dr. Swan and ask him for his very specialist help in doing so. And he would look at each case in a case-by-case basis. So obviously he wouldn't recommend exactly the same setup in Taiwan as he would to Wales, for example. And he would take into account the climate and the topography and so on of each distillery, as well as the budgets that they might have in order to build their distilleries. But the STR cask is something that has now been quite widely adopted, not just by the distilleries that he was involved in, but by other distilleries too. And it is essentially a way of, it's a cask that produces a very rich set of flavors in quite a short space of time because of the way it's been treated, because it's been shaved on the inside. So it's previously held red wine or sherry or whatever it may be. That first layer has been shaved away. It's been toasted, so given a little light toast, and then heavily charred, which Jim Swan discovered that this method of treatment of a cask would actually then, when you put spirit into it that was destined to become whiskey, regardless of the climate that they were based in, would produce incredible, almost accelerated results in a much shorter space of time than you would find in a normal ex-bourbon cask, for example. And therefore, it's been adopted all across the world by many distilleries. Kingsbarns was one of the distilleries that Jim Swan worked with, and so therefore they do use STR casks. But you see them in use in the Cotswolds Distillery, Spirit of Yorkshire here in Yorkshire, Kavalan in Taiwan. There's a fairly endless list of distilleries now using them, because they're a really great resource for new distilleries, particularly where they need to get product bottled as soon as possible to get a return on their investment. Therefore, it's vitally important they find a cask type that's really going to help them do that. So the STR does that. And so this, say 4 years old. So I'm nosing this at full strength at 46%. And I'm going to taste it at 46% also. It's a lovely, lovely fruity, with some real lovely spices going on. The fruits are things like apples, pineapples. There's a bit of tropical fruit going on in there. Yeah, maybe a bit of peach with a touch of cinnamon. and that follows through to the flavor. I get a little bit more maybe boiled sweet, but that spice is really redolent. It really makes your tongue tingle. I always love a whiskey that gives me that kind of opal fruit moment, the made to make your mouth water thing. Some of you may remember. If not, look it up. A whiskey that makes my mouth water for me is on its way to good things. Now I'm going to add a touch of water to this. And I'll show you how much water I'm going to add. Literally just a few drops to begin with. This isn't cask strength, it's 46%, the bare minimum being 40%, as I'm sure you're aware, to be called Scotch whisky. Now, why 46%? Some of you may ask. And the reason it's 46% is that this whisky has been non-chill filtered, which is a non-process. So why would you advertise a non-process? What's the point of that? Well, the point is that most commercial whiskies would be chill filtered in order to allow them to be bottled at 40% or 43%. Because if you don't chill filter whiskey, you're leaving fatty acids and lipids that have been imbued into the whiskey through distillation and maturation, and are there in stasis, generally speaking, up to 46% alcohol. But once you reduce that liquid to less than 46%, these fatty acids and lipids display themselves in a form of kind of a cloudy haziness in the bottle or in the glass. Now, if you look at, wherever you are in travel retail or specialist retail, and you see a bottle of whiskey on the shelf and it looks cloudy compared to all these other, lovely clear bottles, then most people's reaction, because we all buy with our eyes, would be, well, there must be something wrong with that, so I'm not going to buy it. And that's a sweeping generalization, but I think you know where I'm coming from with that. So if you want to leave the fatty acids and lipids in, which contribute to texture, they don't necessarily contribute to the flavor, but I'm certain I notice when I'm tasting non-chill filtered whiskies that there's a slightly more oily, maybe velvety texture, which I detect when I'm swallowing it. But if you want to bottle non-chill filtered, you have to do so at 46% or more in order for that for those fatty acids not to display themselves as a haze in the bottle. Hence, when you see a bottle on the shelf of your favorite whiskey shop or wine and spirit shop, it says 46% on it, you can be fairly certain that it's non-chill filtered, and that whiskey producer has, to my mind, gone to that extra mile for the whiskey lover, to allow them to decide if they want to add water to it, but also that it's chill filtered. Okay, so you may be able to see that whiskey has gone slightly cloudy on the addition of water, because I've almost certainly taken it, well, I've obviously taken it below 46%, and you can now see a slight cloudiness appear in that, and that's perfectly natural, and it's an exciting thing, not a bad thing. So what about once you've added water to it? Get a lot more kind of vibrant citrusness coming out of there. Still getting some of that tropical fruits, which is great, and I would kind of expect that from the STR casks. The water has done that no harm whatsoever. I mean, for a 4-year-old or so Scotch single malt, it's just great. I think they've done a really, really good job with that. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next whiskey. It's a nice tall bottle, isn't it? So this is made by our friends at Spey Distillery, or Speyside Distillery, which ironically isn't in Speyside, but that's another story. And this is the Tritina Cask strength. There are two variants. There's a normal Trittina, I think bottled at around 46, and this is the cask strength batch 2, which is bottled at 59.1% alcohol. I'm just going to just to let you know that the King's Barnes, you can still buy it, and it's around 45 quid a bottle, by the way, which isn't bad at all for what you're getting. Let me just bring up a slide with. Okay, so this is where the Speyside Distillery is. So it's actually a bit sort of south and west of Speyside itself. And here it is on the left. Very charming looking place. Interestingly, this distillery, the current distillery, was commissioned in 1962, but not completed until 1987. So I think it probably deserves to go into the record books for the longest build. Particularly when you think about somewhere like Kavalan in Taiwan, where they actually completed the build in 8 or 9 months, I think it was. But yeah, but sometimes good things take time and are worth the wait. So it's located near Kingusi in the Cairngorms National Park. They have fairly small copper pot stills with a small production capacity to match, and they generally use ex-Bourbonnais sherry casks and utilizing a lightly peated barley variant. Okay, so I'm just going to pour myself a small measure of the Spey. It's a very light color, and I know a lot of people are, we are affected by the way we, perceive things visually, and a lot of people would maybe look at that and think, oh, it's too light. There can't be much flavor to that. And I've heard a lot. One of the favorite was some people would say the darker it is, the peatier it is, and as we all know by now, that's simply not the case. So don't let the color fool you, because this is a real fruit bomb, as I remember. So even without water, I'm getting a lot of citrus fruit, a lot of kind of hedgerow, herbal, kind of flora. It's lovely, really. Kind of reminds me of the summer. Remember the summer? I don't. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to this. Being cask strength at 59.1, this should be able to take a fair amount of water. Yeah, I mean, I get kind of lemon bonbons, slight nettly gooseberry sharpness. There's a real kind of acidity to it. Again, on the nose, like the King's Barnes, it's making my mouth water. What's wrong with me? Let's give it a taste now. So you get all that citrus and herbaceousness. On the palate, there's just this little addition of some nice creme glaze. So a very light custard, just going over the top. So almost like a citrus trifle or something like that. But really, really lovely, fresh, complex. It's got a lovely long finish as well. Really well put together. and you can really taste those fruits, sharpness on the lips and on the front of the tongue. Really, really good stuff. Okay. So we're going to go over to the Isle of Arran now, and this is Arran quarter cask. Now, it's slightly, well, it's not confusing, but we need to now refer to this distillery as Locranza. So Arran Distillers, but this distillery is Locranza, and the reason for this is that there used to be only one distillery on Arran, which was where this whiskey comes from. But now there are two, but they're owned by the same company, the Arran Distillers Company. But one is in the north and is the original distillery, and one is in the south, which is producing heavily peated single malt whiskies, which is called Lag, which is named after, I think, the last of the illicit distilleries that departed Arran before Locranza was opened. So it's a historic name, but it does mean you've got two distilleries under the same umbrella of Arran Distillers. So this is Arran Locranza, okay, and this is the quarter cask bottling at 56.2%. Just to let you know that the Spey Tratina batch 2 cask strength is around 55 pounds. Okay, you can still find it. Okay, so there's the map of Scotland showing Arran and particularly the Locranza distillery. You can get to it a multitude of ways. Easiest way is to get the ferry from close to Glasgow. I think it took about an hour, maybe a little bit longer on the ferry from Glasgow. And it's definitely worth doing. I mean, Arran was such a beautiful island. I mean, Scotland is such a beautiful place anyway, but Arran was particularly so. And it kind of reminded me of the Lake District in northern England, where kind of rolling countryside and windy roads, and yeah, it's just really gorgeous. So definitely, if you're feeling inclined, get yourself over there. Obviously not now, but when circumstances allow. And here you go. So Arran Distillers was founded by Harold Curry in 1994, and this distillery officially opened in 95. So it was kind of the first of the new distilleries, if you like. So it's even 10 years before Kilchoman. So it was at a time when really whiskey's fate was kind of uncertain at the time. It certainly wasn't at its most popular in the 90s. It was really only in the noughties it started to really take off. So it was a big risk at the time, but they kept at it. Thankfully, you see the two pairs of small copper pot stills, large variety of casks used. And then mention of the new distillery on the south of the island. So that the Lag distillery is essentially there so firstly, so that they can make heavily peated single malt, which is very, very popular worldwide now. But also they'll be able to make a blended Arran whiskey using the makes from the two distilleries as well. But Arran, as a whiskey, to my mind, is is lovely, lovely, sweet, unctuous whiskey. And let's just see if that bears out on this. And this is cask strength again to 56.2%. Let's just see what we have in here. Yeah, so compared to the first two, which had this lovely citrus dominated, fruity dominated, here is a little bit more dessert like. Now you would expect it to be slightly oakier, if that's not really the correct term, but slightly spicier, more oak influence, because quarter cask, as it sounds, it's a much smaller cask, and therefore you get a much more wood contact within the cask than you would in a standard bourbon cask, or especially a sherry cask. So you're going to see more oak influence, although not, perhaps that's balanced out with the Kingsbarns, the fact they're using the STR casks, which they won't necessarily be using in Arran, and particularly this bottling. Now you still get a bit of fruitiness. It's more like kind of slightly barbecued bananas or something. Get a lovely smoky vanilla flavor off it, but not too sweet. Anyway, let's give it a try at full strength. Yeah. So this for me is a lot more, well, first of all, it's a lot spicier. So I'm getting a really almost overwhelming spice kick on the back of the palate. Almost slightly peppery as well, actually. But at the same time, as I'm swallowing it, I'm getting a lovely, oily, viscous mouthfeel. And the finish is just, it appears to be endless. It appears to just go on and on and on. And that, that's something that is often overlooked in all manner of tastings, is the finish. And generally, if the finish is long and luxurious like this, that's a real big tick in the box. Let's add a little bit of water to it. I must admit, I love that intensity at full strength. And if you end up buying any of these after this tasting, you may choose not to necessarily add water to them at home. Okay. So it is a slightly different proposition with water, as you'd expect. There's a lot more kind of nettly, herbal, fresh flavors coming through. Maybe a little bit of apple strudel. A little bit less of the spicy intensity, but still, it's still there, and the finish is still very long and luxurious. Yeah, definitely no complaints there. What do you think? You think they've done a good job? I certainly would say so. I quite like these new bottles that they've done as well. They've come a long, long way, I can tell you that. Okay, so from 3 relatively young distilleries, we're going to look at one of the, well, in fact, we've got the next 2 whiskies are from pretty old properties. So this first one is from Mortlach, if you can see past the Game of Thrones logo. And this is from Dufton, the Speyside. It was in fact the first legal distillery in Dufton before the likes of Glenfiddich and so on. Let me just... Now, I think the Arran, the quarter cask, was around 65 quid if memory serves me, and it is still available, and I think very good value. I'm just going to get you up the slide for Mortlach. There we go. So there you can see Mortlach Distillery, the location. So that is slap bang in the center of Speyside, essentially. And Mortlach is one of those distilleries, almost like a legendary distillery. And you can see why they chose it for Game of Thrones nonsense. I mean, not nonsense. I love Game of Thrones, and I love Mortlach. Do they need to be together, though? But anyway, regardless. So there we go. So opened in 1823, making it the first legal distillery. That should actually say in Dufton. And located on the fringes of Dufton in Keith, amongst very beautiful countryside, very beautiful landscape, using a traditional method of distillation as you'd expect, although latterly in its lifetime employed what they call a 2.81 distillation cycle, which involves basically reserving portions of distillate from one still, redistilling it again, and then adding it back into the mix, which they have estimated 2.81 distillation, which essentially gives Mortlach this really classic meaty style, which is much revered. I think it's Dave Broom who refers to it as the beast of Speyside or something like that, for that very reason. It's generally seen as a very robust and meaty style of spirit that comes out of Mortlach, which lends itself really beautifully to the utilization of sherry casks. So you'll see a lot of Mortlach being used, matured in sherry casks. This has been, I think it's actually ex-bourbon, which is quite unusual, but a nice change. Let's give it a little pour. Let's have a little look at this. So most Mortlach actually goes into blending, which is the case for most commercial single malt distilleries. But because of this really classic, meaty, robust style, it's very highly sought after for blending because it lends that character. It will essentially make up for any shortcomings in a blend quite comfortably. And even using bourbon casks, you smell that. It's so meaty. It's like a deli counter, Let's get a slight saltiness off it. Let's give it a little taste. So this is bottled at 46%. So similarly to the Kingsbarns. So non-chill filtered. Yeah, so really big, chewy. You've been spoken to. It's just, it is beastly. It really, in the best possible way, it really does get you by the throat. And so I'm going to add a little bit of water to it. Now, you think the water would calm it down a little bit, but I think I've just made it angry. Yeah. That's a really well put together whiskey. Now, Mortlach is one of the distilleries owned by Diageo, who own 29 single malt distilleries in Scotland, and this is just one of them. And they've kind of become the keepers of, or certainly preserving the certain distillery regimes. And at Mortlach, this 2.81 distillation run is one of those things. Plus, they use worm tubs or a worm tub at Mortlach, which is essentially a very, very old-fashioned way of condensing the vapor into liquid again, involving a wooden vat of water and a cold tube running through it. So it's a very traditional way of doing it. And in fact, there are a number of Diageo distilleries that still utilize the worm tub. But a very, very lovely whiskey. What do you think, though? Do you like it? Now, I think the normal price on that is about 120 quid. But a little birdie tells me that there are offers to be had. So I think I've seen it for 80 quid or 85 quid, something like that. So do shop around. You don't need to pay full price for that. Okay, so we'll move on to Glen Turret, which you may not know that well as a single malt yet, but you will know that previously quite a bit of its make would go into the famous Grouse blended Scotch whisky, and certainly up until recently the famous Grouse experience was based at the Glen Turret distillery. However, they've since the distillery was sold and bought by Lalique, or a consortium led by Lalique, a French luxury glass manufacturer. And you can see the bottle obviously has been they have been rebranded quite significantly already. And let me just bring up so you can see where it is. So you can see it's a little bit further south, kind of adjacent to Perth. In a place called Crieff, close to a place called Crieff. There's a little bit of contention surrounding Glen Turret's kind of assertion that they were established. Well, I've written 1763 on the label. It's 1775. Well, no, it says 1763 on there as well. But essentially, the current distillery didn't start distilling till 1818 anyway. So, it's still an old distillery, but previously it has been kind of advertised as the oldest distillery, working distillery in Scotland. But that doesn't necessarily bear out entirely. But it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, they make good whiskey, and they've been doing it for a long time. So what's a few decades between friends. They only have a pair of copper pot stills, so that it's a relatively small production. Normally use unpeated barley, but they used to run a run of heavily peated spirit for, I think it was the Black Grouse, which was the peated grouse. But obviously, because they no longer have that tie, then they won't necessarily be having to do that anymore. And mainly ex-bourbon maturation, but with more and more emphasis on wine and sherry. And I think certainly we're going to see, because you've got a couple of guys from ex-Macallan, so Bob Delgado and Ken Greer, who were both very high up in the world of Macallan, wanting to essentially recreate that very sherried style of single malt, which a lot of people really enjoy. Now, I have to admit, having tasted this once or twice, that I really do like it. I think they've done a really, really good job so far. So this is the 12-year-old 2020 maiden release in the new livery, which has been matured in European oak sherry casks. And it's even next to the Mortlach, which is, beastly, as we mentioned earlier on. This is equally beastly in terms of the meaty spiciness, but again in a very good way. So this is kind of classic sherry cask territory. Not everyone likes sherry cask whiskies, and I get that. It's a very specific set of flavors which some people don't. It just doesn't suit them. It's just too overwhelming, and perhaps it's more like a cognac or a slightly richer style. But I must admit, when it's a good sherry cask whiskey, I'm generally very happy. Not all distilleries, I think, suit sherry casks. So, for example, Kilchoman, personally speaking, I think their spirit style or distillate character suits the bourbon cask more. It's not to say I haven't tried good sherry casks, but I don't think they're as good as the very best of the ex-bourbon bottlings. But Glen Turret would appear certainly couples well to a sherry cask, and I think we'll be seeing more and more of this. And this is bottled at 46%. Yeah. Just really big, bold. I think it's pretty clean sherry as well. Maybe a tiny touch of sulfur, but I'm not 100%. Some people are really sensitive to sulfur. I'm kind of in the middle somewhere. I don't think it has. And there's just this lovely, warming, spicy intensity to a good sherry cask whiskey, which, particularly at the moment when it's pretty cold out, it's just winter warming wonderland, isn't it? Lovely stuff. Well done, Glen Turret. Okay, so we're on to our final whiskey. Can you believe it? Unless you've been rewinding sneakily. So our final whiskey is a Benromac, 10 years old. Now this is from Speyside. This is from Forres, which is just west of Elgin. Went there a few years ago now. Nice tour and tasting there. Unusually for a Speyside distillery, they use peated barley, and they use quite a hefty, a medium peated barley, around 14 phenol parts per million, which is the way they measure basically how peaty a whiskey is. So let's have a look. So there's Benromac right up there. And so this was a distillery that was also owned by Diageo up until I think 1987, or 83 rather. Sorry, and essentially leading up to 1983, Diageo had decided already that they weren't going to continue distillation at the distillery with surplus to requirements, as happens sometimes, I guess. So they were, taking equipment from Benromach and transplanting it to various other distilleries that needed that equipment. The 80s was a pretty brutal decade for whiskey making in Scotland, in that. In fact, 83 particularly was a really bad year for whiskey making. You saw the closures of the Brora distillery and Port Ellen distilleries, which very sad. I mean, very happy now because both those distilleries are going to be brought back to life. But Benromach was another casualty of this brutal decade in which we lost a hell of a lot of really good malt distilleries. Gordon and MacPhail, who kind of legendary independent bottlers who really brought single malt whiskey to the fore in the 1960s with the Connoisseur's Choice range. And they, along with Glenlivet and Glenfiddich, you could almost credit the three of them with creating the single malt whiskey market back in the 60s. Because prior to that, it was all about blended Scotch whiskey. But it was those three that really drove the demand for single malt whiskey, and Gordon and MacPhail particularly globally. So that Elgin-based Gordon and MacPhail have been happily going about bottling whiskies from other distilleries for many, many years and making a very good business out of it. Decided in the late 20th century that they actually wanted to get into distilling themselves. And so that's what they did. They bought Benromach, but it took them 5 years from when they bought it to when it actually could start distillation in 1999. They had to obviously replace all the equipment that had been removed, but then they had to obviously do lots and lots of experimentation and dummy runs and so on to make sure the place was working as it should. So it eventually opened in 1999, as I say, and they wanted to keep the peated profile of Benromach as it was in its heyday. So they did, and that's what they've done ever since. So it's a really good example of, if you want a peated whiskey that isn't from Islay or Skye or one of the more traditional areas that you might expect peated whiskey to come from. But this is just the medium peated version. There is a peat smoke Benromach where they use a slightly more heavily peated malted barley, and you're kind of more into Lefroy territory in that respect. But I think in this it works the best. So they use mainly first fill ex-bourbon casks, so you're always going to get quite a lot of oak into play in the whiskies from Benromach. So you've got the smokiness from the peated barley, but you've also got the sweet spiciness from the first fill ex-bourbon cask. First fill essentially means it's the first time it's been filled with Scotch whisky after it's been sent over from the US and been emptied of bourbon in the US, obviously. And second fill is just the second time it's used in the Scotch whisky industry, and so on. Let's give it a little taste. The peat is definitely ever so slightly dominant, but you still get a nice kind of tropical fruit and orchard fruit background. There's some spicy oak as well, spicy vanilla. A little bit of water added. Mm. The water just restrains it slightly, which is quite nice. I think for me, without water, it was very in your face, which sometimes you want. Let's face it, sometimes we want a slap around the jowls, but for me, the water just tempers it ever so slightly and just balances out some of the kind of enthusiasm. So Gordon MacPhail have done an incredible job with Ben Romack and reviving, what was a lost distillery essentially, and bringing distillation back to Forres. What do you think? Do you like that slight peatiness? Well, that is pretty much the end of this tasting, ladies and gents. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been really, I haven't tasted these for a little while, so it's been nice to go back to them. But I hope that they've hit the spot for you. Obviously, you can watch this again should you so wish. Go back to the whiskies, compare and contrast. Take your time with them. I hope this hasn't rushed you through them too quickly. But obviously, we've got plenty of other videos and tasting packs. So if you go to the website at thewhiskylounge.com, you'll be able to see what's available there. But for now, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And I look forward to, well, what I look forward to most is welcoming you to a physical event, a festival or a tasting. In the meantime, it's been a pleasure presenting for you, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you. Take care.